A lone figure pauses before a gateway of pure light. This is Elrondin, a high elf loremaster, and the shimmering portal behind him leads to the blessed realm of Valinor, a paradise now sealed by order of his own people. His hand hesitates, for the council has decreed total isolation, forbidding any from leaving or seeking answers. But Elrondin has seen the impossible, a slow fading in the legendary light of the two trees that sustain their world. His decision to defy the council and step through that portal is an act of ultimate rebellion, a personal quest that risks not just exile, but the shattering of his people's eternal peace. By the end of this story, you will understand the true, world-altering reason the High Elves abandoned their perfect home forever. We begin with a single question, a mystery that haunted the very heart of paradise. What could possibly be powerful enough to dim the light of an undying land? I am curious to know where you are joining this tale from, and what the local time is for you right now. What would you risk to learn a dangerous truth? The first tremor in paradise arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper of failing light. It was during the ceremony of the first dew, a timeless ritual where the gathered elves would sing as Telperian's silver radiance coalesced into drops of pure light. Elrondin stood among the choir, his voice raised in a hymn older than the sun, when he saw it, a flicker, a momentary dimming in the colossal tree's luminous canopy, as if a great, weary breath had been drawn. The sacred dew, which should have fallen in a shimmering rain, instead pattered down as a thin, pallid mist. A collective gasp cut through the song, the flawless harmony shattered into a discord of murmured fears and wide-eyed stares. For the first time in all their immortal history, something in Valinor had simply failed. This was not an attack from some outside darkness. This was a sickness from within, a chilling suggestion that their undying land was not so undying after all. Faith in the Valar's protection, once as solid as the earth beneath their feet, now felt as fragile as glass. How could the guardians of the world allow this to happen? Were they powerless, or worse, unaware? Elrondin's scholarly mind, trained to seek patterns and truths, could not unsee that single, terrifying flicker. While the others sought comfort in denial or frantic prayer, he knew this was a symptom of a deeper malady. That first crack in perfection was not an accident. It was a demand, a silent scream from the world itself, and he was the only one listening. The gardens of Valinor were a symphony of color and life, yet Elrondin walked their paths with a new and heavy purpose. His search led him away from the grand concourses, into the secluded groves where the roots of Laurelin, the golden tree, plunged deep into the world. There, nestled against the colossal, glowing bark, he found it. A single vine, unlike any other, wrapped itself around the tree's base. Its leaves were not simply wilted, but brittle and black, and its stem was a sickly, mottled gray. It looked ancient and dead, yet it possessed a terrible, unnatural strength, digging into the living wood like fingers of iron. This was no ordinary decay. This was a parasite. With a careful hand, Elrondin reached out and grasped the withered vine. The moment his fingers closed around it, a jolt of freezing energy shot up his arm. A faint, black mist seemed to seep from the plant, recoiling from the innate light within him, as if it were a physical flame. The vine itself crumbled to dust in his grasp, leaving behind only a lingering chill, and the faint, acrid smell of ozone. His heart hammered in his chest. This was the proof. The blight was not some accident of nature or a sign of the world's natural aging. This was a deliberate act, a poison administered with malicious intent. Someone, or something, was actively attacking the very heart of their paradise. Faith in the Valar's oversight was one thing, but this was a crime. This required an investigation the Council would never authorize. He knew then where he had to go, a place he had not visited in centuries, a repository of knowledge so old and so complete that even the Valar's own early mistakes were recorded there. He had to reach the Hall of Annals, to seek answers in the forbidden records of a time before perfection, to find a name for this new and hidden enemy. The Hall of Annals was silent as a tomb, its towering shelves shrouded in dust and memory. Elrondin did not come alone. At his side stood Caladwen, a warrior maiden whose spear had once guarded these very halls. Her presence was a calculated risk, for her loyalty was not to the Council's edicts, but to the truth of Valinor itself. Together, they moved through the cavernous silence, their footsteps echoing in the vast, forgotten space. They were not seeking the grand histories of victories and kings. They were searching for the records of failure, for the tales the Valar had hoped would be forgotten. Deep in the most restricted wing, behind a door sealed with a lattice of solidified light, they found them. The scrolls were brittle, their script a flowing, archaic form of Elvish that spoke of an age before the trees fully blossomed. The text spoke of a primal, ravenous force, a magic that did not create or nurture, but only consumed. It was known as the Unlight, a void that fed on pure energy, draining life and light until nothing but a hollow shell remained. The Valar had battled this insidious power in the earliest days, finding it could not be destroyed, only bound and sealed away with the greatest of their combined might. The seals were woven from the very essence of the two trees, designed to be eternal, but eternity, the scrolls ominously suggested, was a concept, not a guarantee. The ancient wards required a constant, ambient flow of light to sustain them. A dimming, however slight, would be like a slow leak in a dam. Elrondin's blood ran cold as he connected the fragments. The flicker in Tulperion, the parasitic vine on Lorelin, they were not the cause of the problem. They were symptoms. The Unlight was not gone. Its prison was cracking, and its influence was seeping back into the world, drawn to the very sources of power that imprisoned it. This was no external invasion. The enemy was not at the gates. It was beneath their feet, a patient, starving shadow that had been waiting for a single moment of weakness. And someone had to know. Someone had to be helping it, consciously or not, to erode the foundations of their world. The fading of the trees was not a natural decay. It was a deliberate, slow assassination, and the assassin was already inside the house. The Hall of Annals felt a world away as Elrondin stood in the chamber of the High Council. The air here was thick with the scent of polished stone and ancient incense, a stark contrast to the dust of forgotten truths. Before him, the Council of Elders sat arrayed in a semicircle, their faces serene masks of immortal authority. Lord Finvarin, his silver hair like a crown of starlight, listened with an impassive gaze as Elrondin laid out his evidence. He spoke of the failing light, the parasitic vine, and the chilling records of the Unlight. He described the slow, insidious poison leaking from a prison everyone had believed was eternal. For a moment, a profound silence filled the chamber. Then a soft, dismissive chuckle rippled through the elders. Fear-mongering, Lord Finverin declared, his voice calm and final. You would have us abandon our peace, our very home, over a wilted leaf and the frightened whispers of a dusty scroll. He rose, his presence seeming to fill the room. Stability is the foundation of our paradise. Elrondin, you speak of cracks, but you are the one swinging the hammer. To pursue this fiction is to invite the very chaos you claim to fight. You will cease this investigation. You will speak of this to no one. The order was not a suggestion. It was a command, delivered with the weight of millennia. In that moment, Elrondin understood the true nature of their prison. It was not built of walls or light, but of perfect, unyielding denial. Obedience would mean watching their world fade into shadow, one silent flicker at a time. Defiance was no longer a choice. It had become his only duty. The council's dismissal echoed in the silence that followed, a hollow verdict that settled like a shroud. Yet in that quiet, a resolve far stronger than stone began to form. Under the cover of a moonless night, within a secluded grove veiled by silver-leafed willows, Elrondin and Caladwen made a pact. Their voices were whispers against the vast, sleeping peace of Valinor, a solemn vow to defy the edict of their leaders and continue the search for the truth. They were not alone for long. One by one, other elves came to them, drawn by their own unspoken fears. There was a master of plant lore who had seen the strange gray rot on distant flowers, a stargazer who swore the constellations themselves seemed dimmer, and a young artisan who felt a strange chill in metals that should have been warm with inner light. They were a small circle, bound not by rebellion, but by a shared, terrifying clarity. They could all see the cracks that the council refused to acknowledge. Their only hope now lay with one of the oldest and most reclusive of their kind, a sage who had withdrawn from elven society long ago. Loremaster Miriel dwelled in the remote northern peaks, in a sanctuary carved into the living rock, a place rumored to hold knowledge considered too dangerous for the main libraries. It was said she had studied the earliest, most raw forms of magic, the kind that existed before the Valar brought order to the world. She alone might understand the true nature of this ancient blight, and more importantly, who could have learned to wield its corrosive power. Every whispered meeting, every furtive glance exchanged in the open streets, was fraught with the threat of discovery. They were not just searching for an answer anymore. They were becoming fugitives in their own paradise. The journey north was a pilgrimage into a world gone wrong. The air grew thin and cold, the vibrant colors of Valinor fading to muted grays and stark whites as they climbed. The mountain paths, once said to be guided by gentle spirits, were now treacherous and unpredictable. Without warning, a section of the trail ahead would crumble into a chasm, or a sudden rockslide would thunder down from above, forcing them to scramble for cover. An unnatural silence pressed in on all sides, broken only by the howling wind that sounded less like air and more like a mournful cry. It felt as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, watching and waiting. Caladwen, when moved with a hunter's grace, her senses stretched to their limit. She was the first to notice the shift in the shadows, the way the jagged rocks seemed to twist and contort at the edge of vision. A low growl rumbled through the stone beneath their feet, a sound that was not of the earth, From the mist-shrouded cliffs, figures emerged. They were the spirits of the mountain, ancient guardians of stone and stream, but they were horribly changed. Their forms, once luminous and fluid, were now jagged and dark, their eyes burning with a dull, hateful gray light. They moved with a jerky, predatory intent, surrounding the small band of elves. Caladwen's spear was a blur of silver. She did not strike to kill, but to deflect and disarm, her movements a desperate dance against her own people's protectors. Her blade met corrupted stone with a shower of sickly sparks. It was clear these spirits were not acting of their own will. They were being puppeted, their innate magic twisted into a weapon. This was the final, horrifying proof. The blight was not confined to the two trees. It had seeped into the land's very soul, turning its guardians into assassins. They were not just fleeing the council's decree anymore. They were fighting a civil war against their own home. Every step deeper into the mountains felt like a betrayal, and every safe pass they found felt less like a victory and more like a temporary stay of execution. What other defenses of Valinor had this silent enemy already turned? The crystal cave was not a shelter, but a prison of knowledge. Loremaster Miriel sat at its heart, her form so still she seemed another facet of the glowing geodes around her. She did not look up as Elrondin and Caladwen entered, her voice a dry rustle of parchment. I felt the balance shift. I knew someone would come. Her eyes, when she finally lifted them, held a deep, weary sorrow. You seek a name for the poison. You have found one, but you have not found its source. The unlight is the weapon, but it is not the hand that wields it. She gestured to a vast, rough-hewn crystal that dominated the chamber, its interior swirling with murky shadows. Within that focused stone, I have watched the truth take root. The blight is the lingering essence of Morgoth, the first and greatest enemy of the Valar. We were fools to believe his influence was wholly banished. His hatred is a seed that can lie dormant for ages, waiting for the right soil, and it has found it. A cold dread settled in the room. Muriel's gaze was unwavering. There is a faction among our own people, elves of high lineage and deep resentment. They call themselves the Epanana, the Unbound. For centuries, they have whispered in hidden corners, craving not the shared light of the trees, but a power they could command alone. They see the Valar's guardianship as a cage. They believe that by harnessing the unlight, by learning to feed it and direct it, they can usurp the very source of our world's power and become masters of their own destiny. They are not invaders. They are gardeners, patiently nurturing this blight within the heart of our paradise, believing they can control the fire that will consume them all. The fading of the trees is not an accident or a natural end. It is a deliberate act of sabotage, a slow siphoning of power to fuel a mad bid for dominance. The true enemy was never a monster from the outside. It was the arrogance festering within, a betrayal so profound it threatened to unravel creation itself. Muriel leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. They believe they are stealing the flame, but they are only feeding the void. The unlight cannot be controlled. It can only consume, and when the last light of the trees is gone, its prison will shatter completely, and it will feast upon Valinor until nothing remains but a silent, lightless husk. There is no containing this now, no reforging the ancient seals. The corruption has woven itself too deeply into the fabric of our world. Stopping it requires a sacrifice as great as the threat itself. The only path left is one of absolute loss. The weight of her words was a physical blow. This was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a countdown to an annihilation orchestrated by their own kind. The question was no longer who or why, but what terrible price would be enough to pay for their world's survival. The crystal cave's terrible truth felt like a shard of ice in Elrondin's heart as they descended the mountain. Their return to the gleaming spires of the elven city was not a homecoming, but an invasion. They went not to the secluded groves, but straight to the heart of their society, to the chamber of the High Council itself. This time, Elrondin did not come as a supplicant. He came as an accuser. He stood once more before Lord Finvarin, but now he held more than just theories. He held a name, the Apanana, the Unbound. He spoke Muriel's revelation, his voice cutting through the chamber's serene silence, detailing the faction's mad plan to usurp the trees and become gods. For a long moment, Finvarin was still. Then, a slow, chilling smile spread across his face, a crack in the marble mask of his authority. "Your reclusive teacher was always too clever for her own good," he said, his voice no longer dismissive, but dripping with a terrifying pride. "You speak of a faction, Elrondin, but you are looking at its architect." The gasp from Caladwen and the others was a sharp intake of collective horror. Finvarin rose, his form seeming to swell with a dark, gathering energy. "You call it corruption. I call it evolution. For millennia, we have lived as children, tending these trees under the watchful eyes of distant guardians. Why should we merely bask in their light when we can possess it, when we can become the light itself?" His eyes blazed with a fanatical fire. "The unlight is not our enemy. It is the key. It consumes the old, shared power, and in its place, we will forge a new one, a power that answers only to us. We are not destroying our world. We are perfecting it, and in doing so, we will ascend." This was not the desperate plan of a fringe group. This was a cold, calculated coup, led by the one elf everyone trusted to maintain stability. The trust that held their society together shattered in that instant. Finvarin's hand moved, and the chamber doors sealed with a thud of solidifying light. "You have seen the design," he said softly. "Now you will become part of its foundation." There was no debate, no more words. Elrondin acted on pure instinct, shoving Caladwen toward a side archway as a bolt of twisted, gray energy erupted from Finvarin's fingertips, scorching the air where they had stood. This was not a fight they could win. It was a desperate, scrambling flight for survival, a race through familiar halls that had become a deadly maze, with their own supreme leader as the hunter. The polished marble corridors of the council spire became a deadly gauntlet. Elrondin's mind raced faster than his feet, every memory of this place now a potential trap. Finvarin's voice echoed behind them, no longer a calm command, but a chilling promise of ascension that spurred his guards to a vicious hunt. They did not head for the grand avenues. Instead, Elrondin led them down a narrow servant's passage, a route known only to archivists and builders, feeling the familiar stone hum with a panic it had never known. Their only hope was a desperate, last-ditch plan to reach the base of the two trees and use the last vestiges of their own inner light to reinforce the ancient, failing wards. But could their small, fading power possibly be enough to mend a breach crafted by their own leader? The very air seemed to resist them, thickening with a greasy, invisible resistance that made each breath a struggle and each step a victory. They were not just running from guards, they were running against the slow, suffocating death of their world. Caladwen moved like a shadow at the rear, her senses tuned to the pursuit. She could hear the disciplined, rhythmic footfalls of the guards, but beneath that, something else scraped and scuttled in the walls. The corruption was not just a spell anymore, it was a living presence in the stone, an intelligence that sought to hinder them. A wall of shimmering light, once a simple barrier for ceremony, now solidified before them, blocking their path with the unyielding strength of a diamond. Elrondin did not hesitate. He pressed his hands against the light, not to break it with force, but to reason with it. He sang a single, pure note, a word of unbinding from a tongue older than the city itself. It was a whisper of the original song that had shaped Valinor, a plea to the world's soul to remember its true nature. The light wavered, recognized the echo of its own creation in his voice, and dissolved into a harmless mist. They slipped through, but the effort left Elrondin pale and drained. Using the old magic was like bleeding his own spirit into the world. The hidden pathways took them through the foundations of their civilization, through gardens where flowers now wept a black, viscous sap, and under bridges where the flowing waters ran sluggish and silent. The closer they drew to the trees, the more the land itself seemed to be in agony. The ground trembled not with the footfalls of their pursuers, but with a deep, resonant pain emanating from the roots below. The brilliant gold and silver light ahead, which had for all of time been a constant, comforting presence, now pulsed erratically like a dying heart. Each flicker was a wave of nausea, a spiritual wound inflicted upon every elf in Valinor. They could feel the unlight feeding, a vast, silent mouth, drinking deep from the wellspring of their existence. The race was no longer just a physical sprint. It was a battle for every precious second, a fight to reach the heart of the blight before the very last drop of light was consumed and the ancient prison of the void shattered open forever. What would be left of their world if they arrived only to witness its final, gasping breath? The grove at the base of the two trees was no longer a place of worship, but a scene of sacrilege. Finvarin's followers, the Epanana, stood in a grim circle, their hands raised not in song, but in a gesture of seizure. Between them, a jagged crystal of obsidian pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic gray light, its dark facets drinking the shimmering essence that flowed from the weeping bark of Laurelin and Tulperion. Each pulse from the stone drew another visible wave of brilliance from the trees, leaving their leaves a little more translucent, their light a little more faint. The air itself tasted of metal and ash, and the ground was littered with fallen leaves that crumbled to dust at a touch. They were not just stealing the light. They were murdering it. Caladwen did not need a command. Her spear was already in her hand, a sliver of defiance against the gathering gloom. With a cry that was both a war cry and a lament, she led their small band forward, not as an army, but as a desperate interruption. They crashed into the circle, not with the elegance of elven combat, but with the raw, clumsy force of those fighting to save a life. Steel met corrupted energy in flashes of violent purple and sickly green. Caladwen moved like a whirlwind, her spear a blur as she parried bolts of twisted magic and broke the concentration of the chanters. Each disrupted note causing the obsidian crystal to flicker uncertainly. Every second she bought was a lifeline. While the clash of arms and energy erupted around him, Elrondin fell to his knees between the two great roots, his hands pressed against the tormented earth. He could feel the tree's agony as a physical pain in his own spirit, a great, keening song of loss. Closing his eyes, he began to sing, not a song of power, but a song of memory. He sang of the first dew on Tilperian's leaves, of the warmth of Laurelin's first golden fruit, of the quiet joy of 1,000 dawns. He poured his own light, his own memories of an uncorrupted Valinor, back into the roots, a tiny, fragile dam against the colossal tide of theft. For a moment, it seemed to work. A soft, silver radiance bloomed beneath his palms, pushing back against the gray tendrils of the unlight. The tree's dimming light steadied, holding its breath. But the ritual's progress had been too great. The crystal, now charged with a terrifying amount of stolen power, glowed with the intensity of a captured star. Finvarin, from the edge of the chaos, simply smiled and gestured. The crystal flared, and a wave of pure negation slammed into Elrondin's fragile song, shattering it. The light he had nurtured was snuffed out instantly. With a sound like a great heart breaking, the two trees dimmed again, their light dropping to a feeble, guttering glow. The point of no return was not on the horizon anymore. It was here, in this grove, in this very second. The choice was no longer about saving their home, but about what they could possibly salvage from its ruin. The feeble glow of the trees was a final, desperate plea. Elrondin knew then that no spell of binding, no act of force, could ever mend what had been broken. The only answer lay in a terrible, ancient symmetry, a magic of absolute exchange. To save a life must be given. He remembered a fragment of text from the Hall of Annals, a rite so pure and so costly, it had been deemed a legend. The confluence of spirits. It required a being of unsullied light to offer up their very essence, to weave their spirit directly into the withering core of the trees, becoming a living sacrifice to reignite the flame. The cost was absolute. The elf would become one with the light, their physical form dissolved forever into the eternal radiance they restored. It was not a death, but a transformation so complete it was a kind of ending. Before he could even speak the terrible words, Caladwen was already stepping forward. Her eyes met his, and in them was no fear, only a fierce and final love for the world they were losing. "I am a guardian of Valinor," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Let my duty be my final act." There was no time for argument, no moment for a proper farewell. As Finvarin and his followers recoiled from the sudden, building intensity of pure purpose, Elrondin began the chant. His voice joined with Caladwen's in a single, ascending note. She raised her arms not in surrender, but in offering, and a brilliant, white light erupted from her heart. It was not the stolen, hungry glare of the unlight, but a radiance that held all the colors of life, all the memories of joy and starlight and song. This light did not push back the shadows, it unmade them. It flowed into the roots of the two trees, a river of healing grace. Where it touched, the gray receded, the weeping bark sealed, and the brittle leaves softened back into living silver and gold. The trees began to pulse with a renewed, steady rhythm, their light growing from a guttering ember into a soft, dawn-like glow. Caladwen's form became a silhouette of incandescent beauty, and then, as the light reached its peak, she dissolved into a million shimmering motes, a final, breathless sigh, merging completely with the restored trees. The grove fell into a profound, awed silence. The air was clean again, the threat severed. The trees stood whole, their light saved, but the price of that salvation hung in the air, a permanent, aching absence. A beloved warrior, a faithful friend, was gone, not to the halls of the dead, but to the very soul of the world she had died to protect. Her sacrifice had sealed the breach, but it had also seared a new and terrible truth into the hearts of all who witnessed it. Paradise was not free. Its eternity was bought with the most precious currency of all. The restored light of the trees felt like a lie. It bathed the grove in a gentle, steady glow, but the silence it illuminated was filled not with peace, but with the ghost of a final breath. Before the stunned, Apanana could even process their failure, the air itself began to change. It grew thick, humming with a presence so vast it made the mountains seem small. The sky above Valinor, always a perfect, star-dusted blue, began to swirl with forms of light and shadow, coalescing into figures of impossible grandeur. The Valar had come. They did not arrive with wrath, but with a sorrow deeper than the oceans. Their voices were not a sound that traveled through the air, but a resonance that spoke directly to the soul of every elf in the land. They had seen it all: the slow poison, the secret faction, the betrayal from the highest seat of trust, and the ultimate sacrifice that had bought this single, fragile moment. Their judgment was not born of anger, but of a terrible, necessary logic. This land was created as a sanctuary, a place of pure light, forever separate from the struggles of the wider world. That separation had been its greatest strength, and it turned out its fatal weakness. The corruption of the Apanana proved that no realm, no matter how blessed, was immune to the poison of pride and the hunger for dominion. The very presence of the elves now posed an existential risk to the trees. Another betrayal, another moment of weakness in some future age, and the unlight would wake again, next time with no sacrifice left to give. The decree was absolute. Valinor must be purged. Every single elf must leave, and the way would be closed behind them forever. There would be no exceptions, no appeals. The Valar offered a choice, but it was a choice between two kinds of endings. They could depart, taking with them their memories and their mortal-shaped spirits, to find a new home in the wide, untamed lands beyond. Or they could choose to stay, not as flesh and blood, but by surrendering their individual selves, their spirits dissolving back into the light of the world, to become one with the eternal song of Valinor, a spiritual dissolution that was a form of death for the people they had been. The announcement rolled across the land like a silent shockwave. In the cities, in the gardens, on the shores, elves stopped whatever they were doing, their hearts freezing in their chests. To be exiled from paradise was a thought so monstrous it had never been conceived. This was not a punishment for a crime they had all committed, but a surgery to save the patient by removing the source of the infection. They were the infection. The Exodus began not with a march, but with a slow, disbelieving gathering. Families clutched each other, their eyes wide with a grief too large for tears. They packed not treasures, but tokens. A single leaf from their garden, a vial of water from a favorite fountain, a stone from the path they had walked for millennia. They were leaving eternity behind, cast out by the very guardians who had invited them in, all because a flaw they had never known was sleeping in their own hearts. The gates of light stood open, not as a welcome, but as a farewell. One by one, then in a great, sorrowful river, the High Elves of Valinor stepped across the threshold, their perfect home shrinking behind them into a memory, then a legend, then a single, brilliant, and forever unattainable star in the sky of a world they now had to learn to call home. The first ship took shape not from ambition, but from necessity, its white hull rising like a silent prayer against the gray shores of a world they were being forced to abandon. Elrondin, his hands still feeling the ghost of Caladwen's light, directed the work with a calm he did not feel. He chose the wood not for its strength alone, but for its memory, selecting trees that had willingly given themselves, their spirit song still humming within the grain. Each plank laid was a testament to survival, a promise that they would not simply flee, but carry a seed of their old world into the new. He moved among the elven shipwrights, his voice steady as he described the lands across the sea, not as the perfect paradise they had lost, but as a canvas of raw, untamed beauty waiting for their song. He spoke of towering forests older than memory, of rivers that sang wild and free, and of mountains that challenged the sky. He painted these visions with his words, weaving a future where their light could be nurtured, not just preserved, where they could build a home that belonged to them, not one they were merely granted. But in the quiet moments, when the rhythmic sound of hammers faded, the vision would falter. The weight of his own choices pressed down on him. His quest for truth had exposed the rot, but it had also been the catalyst that shattered their eternity. Had his need to know been worth the price of their home? Had his defiance, however righteous, ultimately served only to hand Finver in the final excuse he needed to force the Valar's hand? The memory of Caladwen's dissolving form was a constant, sharp ache, a sacrifice that had saved the trees only to ensure their own exile from them. He bore this guilt in silence, a private shadow behind his public hope. Leadership was no longer a title, but a burden he had to carry for her, for every elf who now looked to him for direction in this terrifying new chapter. He would guide them across the wide, unknown water, because the alternative to let despair win was a betrayal of every life already given. The last elven ship strained against its moorings, a pale vessel yearning for a horizon it had never seen. On the gray shore, amid the hushed grief of the final exiles, a solitary figure emerged from the mists. Loremaster Miriel moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her form seeming more spirit than substance. She did not look at the gathered host, but her eyes found Elrondin's, holding a sorrow as deep as the sea they must cross. In her hands, she carried a sphere of flawless crystal, no larger than a heart, and within it, a captured fragment of light pulsed with a soft, steady rhythm. It was the essence of Tulperion and Laurelin, she explained, a sliver of their restored glory drawn forth before the gates sealed forever. This is not a relic of the past, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sighing waves. It is a promise. Guard it with your life, for it is both a beacon to guide you through the trackless ocean and a seed from which a new light may one day grow in your new home. Her warning came next, her gaze shifting to the western horizon, where clouds were gathering like bruises. The journey will test you in ways you cannot foresee. The shadow of Morgoth, though defeated, is a stain upon the world. Its lingering malice hates the light you carry. It will call to the deep things of the sea and twist the very winds against you. Your hope is no longer a land behind you, but the light you hold in your hands. Elrondin accepted the crystal, its warmth a shocking contrast to the chill salt air. The weight of it was immense, not physical, but spiritual. It was the soul of Valinor, entrusted to him alone. As Muriel faded back into the mists from whence she came, he looked from the glowing sphere in his palm to the vast, unknown expanse of water. They were not just fleeing a closed paradise. They were carrying its last ember into a waiting darkness, and every wave that crashed against the shore sounded like a challenge. The ship groaned as if in pain, its timbers protesting the unnatural violence of the waves. The sea, which should have been a pathway, had become a wall of churning black water and shrieking wind. This was no ordinary storm. It felt personal, a furious, grieving tempest that sought to swallow the entire fleet. Elrondin clung to the mast, the crystal sphere clutched against his chest. Its light, which had glowed so steadily on the shore, now flickered wildly, pulsing in time with the thunder that seemed to scream from the horizon they had left behind. He knew then that this was not just weather. It was the final, desperate argument of their homeland. Valinor itself was weeping, its sorrow made manifest in the gale, unwilling to release the children it had cast out. The winds did not push them toward the unknown east, but twisted and fought to spin them back, to drive them onto the invisible shores of a memory. Sailors who had navigated by the stars for millennia found themselves utterly lost, the constellations hidden behind a veil of spiteful cloud and a mist that tasted of salt and regret. It was in the heart of this chaos that Elrondin understood the crystal's true purpose. It was not merely a beacon, it was a compass for the soul. Closing his eyes against the stinging spray, he focused not on the raging sea, but on the small, warm pulse in his hands. He poured his will into it, a silent plea not for calm, but for direction. The sphere responded, its light steadying into a single, sharp beam that cut through the unnatural gloom, pointing unerringly ahead into the deepest, most terrifying part of the storm. The path was not around the chaos, but directly through it. The sea itself was testing their resolve, demanding to know if they were truly worthy of carrying a fragment of its heart into the void. Every wave that broke across the deck was a question. Were they exiles, or were they pioneers? The answer would be written in their courage to sail into the very maw of the tempest, guided only by a fading echo of the home that was trying so hard to keep them. The beam from the crystal did not calm the storm, but carved a path straight through its fury. For 3 days and nights, they sailed this terrifying corridor, walls of black water rising on either side, the howling wind, a constant dirge for the world they had lost. It was on the 4th day, as the storm began to relent into a heavy, unnatural calm, that the true nature of their test revealed itself. The sea ahead began to boil. A shape ascended from the lightless depths, a horror that dwarfed the largest ship. It was a serpent, but one twisted by an ancient malice. Its scales were not the color of the deep, but a leprous, mottled gray, and where eyes should have been, there were only smoking pits that wept a viscous, black fluid. This was no beast of the natural world. It was a creature of the shadow, a guardian of the deep forgotten by time, and it was drawn to the pure, painful light of the crystal, like a moth to a flame. Its massive body coiled through the water, its presence casting a pall of dread that silenced the wind itself. Elrondin watched it come, his mind racing. They could not fight it. No spear or spell could pierce that corrupted hide, but he remembered the nature of their enemy. The unlight did not create, it only consumed. It was drawn to power, to light, with a ravenous, singular hunger. He shouted orders across the heaving decks. A desperate, cruel plan took shape. They would use the very blight that had poisoned their home as bait. Several of the older, slower ships were ordered to fall back. On their decks, the most powerful mages among them gathered, not to weave spells of protection, but to perform a ritual of sacrifice. They drew upon the lingering traces of the corrosive energy that had tainted Valinor, pulling it from the air, from the memory of the stones they carried, from the grief in their own hearts. They focused this gathered darkness into shimmering, gray orbs that pulsed with a sickly, inverted light. These became beacons of concentrated corruption. The great serpent hesitated, its head swinging between the main fleet with its tantalizing crystal and the decoy ships, now radiating a familiar, delicious poison. Its hunger, its very purpose, was conflicted. With a final, agonizing command, the elves on the decoy ships turned their prows away from the fleet, sailing directly toward the monstrosity, their sails filled with a wind of their own making. They sang a hymn of defiance as they sailed to their doom, a beautiful, heartbreaking sound that echoed across the silent sea. The serpent took the bait. With a speed that defied its size, it fell upon the decoy ships. There was no glorious battle, only a terrible, efficient consumption. Jagged teeth of stone and shadow closed over the hulls, and the ships, along with the brave souls aboard, were simply gone, swallowed into the smoking darkness of the beast's maw. The main fleet sailed on, the path now clear, the silence that followed broken only by the soft, guilty lapping of waves against their own hulls. They had survived, but the cost was a fresh wound on their already scarred spirits. The depths had not been empty. They were a graveyard for ancient horrors, and the light they carried was a lantern in the dark, attracting every hungry thing that had been waiting in the void. The silence after the serpent's attack was heavier than the storm. For days, the fleet sailed on, a fragile chain of white ships, bound only by the thin, golden beam from Elrondin's crystal. But the sea had not finished with them. A new tempest rose, not from grief this time, but from a raw, chaotic fury that seemed to tear the very sky apart. This was no sentient argument from Valinor. It was the ocean's own wild heart, and it was merciless. Mountainous waves crashed between the vessels, snapping ropes and shattering masts. The guiding light, once a steady lance, was broken and scattered by the lashing rain and spray, visible only in fleeting, dizzying glimpses. When the dawn finally came, gray and sickly, the sea was a vast, empty plain of heaving water. Elrondin's ship was alone, with only 2 other vessels clinging desperately in its wake. The rest of the armada, the thousands of his people, were simply gone. Panic was a cold tide rising in his own chest. To wait was to risk the lost ships drifting further into oblivion. To search was to abandon the forward momentum that had cost so many lives, and to risk the precious crystal, their only hope for all who remained. He stood on the deck, the weight of the sphere in his hand, feeling like the weight of every soul in his care. His choice was not between right and wrong, but between 2 kinds of failure. He made the hard call, his voice cutting through the wind, to press on. They would trust that the lost ships, each carrying their own skilled navigators and leaders, would find their own way. Perhaps they would rejoin the fleet, or perhaps, in their isolation, they would become the seeds of new, distant civilizations, their paths diverging forever from the main host. It was a desperate hope, a prayer offered to the uncaring sea. The unity of the High Elves, forged in the fires of paradise, was now fractured by the immense, indifferent scale of the world. They were no longer a people in exile, but a scattering of seeds on the wind, each carrying a fragment of the same lost song into the unknown. The gray sea gave way to a bruised purple shoreline, a lonely crescent of sand and jagged rock that seemed to be the only solid thing left in the world. It was not a destination, but a desperate pause. The 3 remaining ships, their sails in tatters and hulls groaning from the strain, limped into the sheltered cove. As the anchors plunged into the murky water, an unnatural stillness descended. No gulls cried, no insects hummed. The very air was thick and tasted of old dust and forgotten words. They had found land, but it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. Moving inland, they discovered the ruins, not grand palaces, but the skeletal remains of simple stone huts, their roofs long collapsed. And among the ruins, they saw the people, or rather, the echoes of people. Faint, shimmering forms of elves moved through the ghost of a village, their outlines blurred like figures seen through warped glass. They were repeating the same simple, heartbreaking tasks, over and over, forever. A spirit mother eternally reached for a child who was not there. A fisherman cast a spectral net into the dry earth. These were not the blessed dead who had passed into the light. These were the lost, the ones who had tried to leave Valinor in ages long past and failed, their spirits trapped on this lonely shore, unable to move forward or return home. One of the shades, a figure who seemed to have been a navigator, paused his endless chart reading and turned his translucent gaze upon Elrondin. His voice was the sound of wind through dead reeds. You follow the same star we did. You carry the same hope, but you must hear the price of our failure. Ahead lies the final gate, not of stone, but of water. A maelstrom that churns with the wrath of the sea itself. It is the last guardian of the mortal shores, and it cannot be fought, only soothed. It devours ships and shatters wills. We tried to force our way through, and it broke us, leaving our spirits anchored here as a warning to all who come after. The only path is a song, not a song of power or command, but one of pure heart, a melody that holds no pride, no fear, and no regret. It must be a lullaby for a raging giant. If there is even a single note of deception or doubt in the singer's heart, the whirlpool will taste it, and it will consume you all. We failed because our hearts were still tangled in the love of the home we had lost. Our song was a lament, and the maelstrom answered with fury. Their warning hung in the silent air, a spectral judgment. To pass this final trial, the elves would have to offer a song of such perfect acceptance and selfless hope that it would calm a force of elemental chaos. It was a test not of their magic, but of their very souls. Had their exile truly purified them, or were they, like the ghosts on this shore, still clinging to the ghost of a paradise that was forever gone? The answer would determine if they joined the whispers on this isle, or finally found their new home. The ghosts watched them with hollow eyes, a silent jury, waiting to see if history would repeat itself. Elrondin knew no existing hymn would suffice. The song of Valinor was one of perfect, unchanging joy, and that was the very echo that had doomed the spirits on this shore. He walked away from the camp, the crystal sphere a cold weight against his chest, and sought a quiet place among the whispering ruins. There, he did not try to remember the grand choirs of the past. Instead, he listened. He listened to the weary sigh of the waves on the gray beach, to the soft, pained breathing of his people, and to the hollow ache in his own heart where Caladwen's light had once been. He let the memory of her sacrifice fill him, not as a wound, but as a foundation. From that foundation of profound loss, he began to weave a new melody. It was not a song of what was lost, but of what that loss had purchased. It held the silver grief of leaving, the golden warmth of a friend's final gift, and the fragile, stubborn green shoot of hope for a shore they had not yet seen. He was not composing a eulogy for paradise, but a lullaby for their own weary hearts. When he returned to the others, his face was pale but resolute. He taught them the melody, line by line, his voice a soft thread in the oppressive silence. At first, their voices were thin and hesitant, cracked by fear and exhaustion. But as they sang, something shifted. The song began to resonate with the island's own trapped magic. The shimmering ghosts paused their endless tasks, turning to listen, their translucent forms seeming to solidify for a moment, as if soothed by a recognition they had longed for across the ages. Their silent chorus joined the living one, not with sound, but with a palpable wave of released sorrow that strengthened the melody. As the final, unified note rose from the company, a miracle unfolded on the horizon. The furious, churning wall of the Maelstrom did not vanish, but its roaring diminished to a deep, rhythmic hum. The violent spirals of water slowed, their chaos organizing into a temporary, glimmering pathway that cut straight through the heart of the vortex. The way was open, but the cost was immediate. As the last note faded, a wave of profound exhaustion swept through the singers. Many stumbled to their knees, their energy spent, their faces gaunt. The harmony had been their key, but it had demanded every ounce of their spiritual strength, laying bare just how fragile their light had become in this harsh new world. Their survival would forever depend on this delicate balance between memory and hope, and the terrible price of weaving them into song. The song's final note left a profound silence, but it was not empty. It was filled with visions. For many elves, the intense focus of the harmony had ripped open a door to the past, flooding their minds with memories of Valinor so vivid they were physically painful. They saw the faces of friends who had chosen dissolution, the light of the trees on familiar paths, the scent of flowers that no longer existed in the world. A low cry of despair rose from one of the singers, a young artisan who crumpled to the sand, sobbing that she could not bear it, that this gray shore was a prison, and their true home was still there, shining and forever out of reach. Her anguish was a spark that threatened to ignite the collective grief of the entire group. The hope they had so carefully nurtured began to crack under the weight of perfect, agonizing memory. Elrondin moved to her side, his own heart aching with the same images. He did not offer empty comfort or dismiss her pain. Instead, he knelt, his voice quiet but clear enough for all to hear. "I see it too," he said. "I see the silver leaves of the courtyard where I first learned to read. I feel the warmth of a sun that was not this sun, and I carry the memory of a friend who gave everything so that we could stand here, grieving on this strange shore." His honesty disarmed them. He was not a leader untouched by loss, but one who bore the same scars. He framed their sorrow not as a chain binding them to the past, but as the fertile soil from which their new life would grow. "We are not abandoning our home," he continued, his gaze sweeping over their weary faces. "We are carrying its heart within us. A tree that is repotted suffers a terrible shock. Its leaves may wilt, and it may long for the familiar earth, but if its roots are strong, it will eventually drink from new ground and grow in ways it never could have in its old pot. Our memories are our roots. Our grief is the water for this new soil. Let it not drown you, but let it help you grow. This is not an ending. It is our most difficult beginning." True leadership, he realized in that moment, was not about navigating by stars or fighting monsters. It was about healing the invisible wounds, about showing others how to hold their sorrow without being crushed by it, and about helping them believe in a dawn they could not yet see. A single sharp cry pierced the solemn air from high atop the main mast. All eyes turned upward to the young scout, her arm outstretched, pointing eastward with a trembling hand. There, on the very edge of the world, a dark line of mountains rose to meet the sky, Middle-earth. The name itself was a whisper on the wind, a promise and a threat woven together. A surge of raw, electric energy coursed through the three remaining ships, a collective gasp of relief, so powerful it seemed to fill the tattered sails. But Elrondin felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, even as hope bloomed in his chest. He raised a hand, his voice cutting through the burgeoning celebration. "That shore may not be the sanctuary we pray for," he called out, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "The shadow we fled was born of a poison that knew no boundaries. If its influence could seep into the heart of Valinor itself, what is to stop it from having already taken root in this new land? Our hope must now walk hand in hand with vigilance. The final approach may be the most dangerous of all, for we risk trading one kind of prison for another." The fleet pressed on, but the mood had shifted from desperate flight to wary approach. They scanned the approaching coastline, not just for safe harbors, but for signs of the familiar gray decay, for twisted trees or corrupted streams. Were they the first to bring light to this land, or were they sailing directly into the outstretched arms of the very enemy they had sacrificed everything to escape? The mountains grew larger, their details sharpening into forbidding cliffs and deep, shadowed forests. This was not the gentle, curated beauty of Valinor. This was a land of wild, untamed power, and it held its breath, waiting to see what these strange, luminous visitors would do. The shadow detached itself from the distant peaks, a blot of moving night against the pale sky. It grew with terrifying speed, resolving into a shape of jagged wings and a serpentine neck, a fell beast whose very existence was a scar upon the world. Its shriek was not a sound of life, but the rasp of stone grinding against stone, a promise of pure malice. It dove straight for the lead ship, its shadow swallowing the deck whole. Elrondin's hand went to the crystal at his chest, its warmth a frantic, panicked flutter. He knew this was no animal. This was a remnant of Morgoth's ancient forges, a creature born of shadow and hate, drawn to their last ember of light, like a moth to a flame that would destroy it. There was no time for fear, only for a terrible, desperate gambit. He tore the sphere from its pouch and raised it high, not as a shield, but as a challenge. He poured his will into it, not to create a gentle beacon, but to forge a weapon of pure, agonizing radiance. The crystal erupted. A silent, concussive wave of white light slammed into the diving beast. It was a light that held no warmth, only truth, a searing revelation of the creature's own corrupted form. The beast screamed, a sound of genuine pain this time, its head whipping aside as its light-blinded eyes smoked. It faltered in its dive, its massive wings beating erratically. In that moment of stunned hesitation, the elven archers found their mark. A volley of silver-tipped arrows sang through the air, not aimed at its scaled hide, but at the delicate membrane of its wings. They were not trying to kill it, for such a thing was likely impossible. They were trying to ground it, to drive it away from the vulnerable ships. Arrow after arrow found its home, tearing through the leathery wings, turning them into ragged sails. The creature thrashed, its roars of fury now mixed with confusion and pain. It was a being of the void, and this direct, defiant light was an agony it had never known. With a final, hateful look from its sightless eyes, it banked away, climbing clumsily back toward the mountains from whence it came, leaving a trail of black, oily blood spattering on the waves below. A ragged cheer went up from the decks, but it died almost instantly. Elrondin lowered the crystal, his arm trembling. The sphere, which had moments before blazed like a captured star, was now a dull, cloudy gray. Its inner light was guttering, a faint pulse like a weary heartbeat. The warmth was gone, replaced by a chilling coolness. Their guide, their last tangible piece of home, was fading before their eyes, and the dark shoreline ahead no longer seemed like a promise, but a hungry mouth waiting to swallow them whole. The wooden hulls scraped against gravel and sand, with a sound that was not a welcome, but a final, grinding farewell to the sea. That first step onto the soil of Middle-earth was a shock of solidity after an eternity of shifting waves. The ground felt strange, its song a raw, untamed rhythm compared to the cultivated harmonies of Valinor. The air smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and something else, a wildness that was both thrilling and terrifying. There were no manicured gardens here, no paths laid by ancient song. This was a land that had grown itself, and it asked for no permission. Their first night was spent not in celebration, but in a state of high alert. Scouts moved in silent pairs up the rocky bluffs, their keen eyes scanning the dark forests that pressed in on the beach. They were not looking for enemies, not yet, but for the basic necessities of survival. A clean, fresh stream was found trickling down a mossy cliff face, its water cold and sharp on the tongue, free of the clinging salt of the sea. Under the boughs of a great, sprawling cedar, they established a temporary camp, its branches offering a semblance of shelter from the unfamiliar constellations that now watched over them. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant cry of a night creature was a question. Was it a simple beast going about its life, or something that had felt the touch of the same shadow they had fled? They had traded the gilded cage of a dying paradise for the vast, unforgiving freedom of the wild. The potential for a new beginning was as palpable as the chill in the air, but it was a potential that had to be carved out with their own hands, guarded with their own weary spirits. They were pioneers in a world that did not know their name, and their first task was simply to prove they belonged here at all. The valley walls rose like ancient, moss-covered sentinels, their peaks guarding a sheltered basin, cradled by a clear, rushing river. Here, Elrondin ordered the ships dismantled, their timbers repurposed into the first frames of their new home. There were no spires of crystal here, no streets of polished pearl. The dwellings were simple structures of stone and fragrant cedar, built with a practical eye for the coming seasons and a defensible perimeter against the unknown. At the community's heart, they raised a great hall, its roof open-beamed and its doors never locked. This would be their council chamber, their refuge, and their library of memories, a physical rejection of the closed doors and secret pacts that had festered in Valinor. Elrondin stood before the gathered people in that unfinished hall, the scent of fresh cut wood sharp in the air. He spoke not of lordship, but of shared burden. Our strength cannot rest in a single leader, he declared, his voice carrying easily in the quiet space. It must live in the trust between us. He established a council of voices, not just elders, but farmers, builders, hunters, and healers, each responsible for a facet of their survival. Every decision, from the placement of a well to the laws of this new land, would be debated openly under this roof. The secrecy that had allowed Finvarin's poison to spread in paradise would find no fertile ground here. While the settlement took shape, Elrondin dispatched his most skilled scouts into the surrounding forests. Their task was not conquest, but understanding. They were to map the game trails, identify sources of fresh water and stone, and learn the language of this new world. They moved with a reverence Valinor had never demanded, for they were no longer guests in a blessed realm, but new threads being woven into a vast, living tapestry. Each returning scout brought not just information, but a piece of the land's soul, a story of a hidden waterfall or a grove of ancient, whispering trees. This fledgling society, born from the ashes of perfection, was consciously built on a foundation of earned trust and hard-won knowledge. Their first city was more than a collection of huts. It was a living promise, a testament to the idea that a community forged in truth, however difficult, could be stronger than any paradise built on a lie. Could they truly outgrow the shadows of their past, or would the old arrogance eventually take root in this new soil? A scout named Leron froze, his hand raised in a silent signal. The forest ahead was moving, not with the wind, but with a slow, deliberate creaking of ancient boughs. From the deep shadows, figures emerged, so tall their heads were lost in the canopy. They were not trees, yet they were made of wood and leaf, with eyes that held the deep, patient light of centuries. These were the Anodram, the shepherds of the trees, whom the elves would later call Ents. They did not speak with words, but with a low, rumbling vibration that traveled through the roots underfoot, a language of the earth itself. Leron, a master of plant lore from Valinor, understood its essence. It was a question, not of who they were, but of their intent. Were they bringers of the axe and the fire, or were they listeners? Leron laid his own weapon on the moss and answered not with his voice, but by placing his palm flat against the trunk of a great oak, sharing a feeling of gratitude and a memory of the lost trees. The ground seemed to sigh in response. The Ents, after a long, silent appraisal, simply turned and melted back into the woods, leaving a path open and unthreatened. It was a lesson in a new kind of diplomacy, one built on respect, not command, but the wilds held darker teachers. Another patrol, led by the warrior Arundel, was not so fortunate. They were tracking a deer near the foothills when the howls began. They were not the clean cries of natural wolves, but ragged, pain-filled shrieks that clawed at the mind. The pack that surrounded them was gaunt, their fur matted, and their eyes burning with a familiar, sickly yellow-gray light. These beasts were not just hungry, they were corrupted, their simple animal spirits twisted by the same shadow that had poisoned the mountain spirits of Valinor. Arundel and his elves stood back to back, their silver blades a stark contrast to the feral darkness. They fought with precision, aiming to disable and drive back, but the wolves fought with a frenzied disregard for their own lives, as if puppeted by a will that valued only destruction. They learned a brutal truth that day. The shadow they had crossed an ocean to escape was already here, a native weed in this new garden. Victory was measured not in glorious conquest, but in survival, and in the grim knowledge that they could never let their guard down. This land was not an empty throne waiting for a ruler. It was a complex, living being with its own allies and its own ancient enemies. They had to learn its rhythms and its dangers, to become a part of its balance, rather than trying to impose their own. Their old sense of inherent superiority, born of the light of Valinor, was a luxury that this raw, demanding world would not tolerate. Would their hard-won wisdom be enough to navigate the deeper, older conflicts slumbering in the heart of Middle-earth? The final spark of Valinor felt cool and inert in Elrondin's palm. He gathered the people in the center of their fledgling settlement, before the steps of the great hall where their new council met. There were no grand words, no ancient hymns recited from memory. Instead, he knelt, and with his own hands, he dug a small hole in the rich, dark earth. He placed the clouded crystal sphere into the soil, this last fragment of a lost world, and covered it gently. A profound silence fell, a collective holding of breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft, silver-green glow began to pulse from beneath the soil, a gentle rhythm like a newborn heart. A single shoot, slender and vibrant, broke through the surface. It grew with a quiet, visible speed, not into a mighty trunk or a towering canopy, but into a graceful stem that unfurled a single, magnificent blossom. Its petals were the color of moonlight on water, and at its center glowed a soft, golden light that pulsed with the same steady warmth the two trees had once radiated. It was a flower, eternal and ever-blooming, its light a gentle dome that bathed the entire clearing in a serene, hopeful luminescence. They named it Gil Estel, the Star of Hope. It did not seek to replicate the lost glory of Valinor, but offered something new, a light born from sacrifice and tempered by the harsh lessons of the sea. This was not a light to be owned or commanded, but one to be shared and protected. It became the spiritual core of their community, a living reminder that their greatest strength was not in recreating the past, but in nurturing the fragile, beautiful future they were building together. In its soft glow, they had finally created a light that was truly their own. The first law written in the new hall was a vow of remembrance. Elrondin gathered not just the elders, but a representative from each surviving ship and every vital craft, from the stone masons to the water finders. This council of exiles was a deliberate echo of the old ways, but its heart was forged in the harsh lessons of the sea and the sacrifice on the shore. They met under the open beams, the scent of raw timber, and the distant cry of an eagle, their only incense. Their first and most solemn decree was not about governance, but about identity. With a unified voice that trembled with both sorrow and resolve, They formally renounced any claim or thought of return to Valinor. The blessed realm was sealed, not just by the Valar, but by their own choice. They declared Middle-earth their home, their only home, and swore a binding oath to protect it from the very darkness they had fled. This was more than a political statement. It was a spiritual severance. They were no longer the High Elves of Valinor, exiles pining for a lost paradise. They were the Eldar of Middle-earth, and their destiny was now irrevocably woven into the fate of this wild, wounded land. Their new laws reflected this profound shift, blending the timeless wisdom of their heritage with the brutal pragmatism their new world demanded. They established codes for fair trade with any peoples they might meet, principles for settling disputes without secrecy, and a shared duty to defend the forests and streams that now sustain them. The light of Gil-Estil watched over their deliberations, a constant reminder that their greatest strength lay not in what they had left behind, but in what they were building together, a society rooted not in perfection, but in hard-won truth. This was the final, quiet death of their old selves, and the true, fragile birth of a new people. The Oath of Guardianship was sworn not in a hall of polished stone, but under the open sky, with the light of Gil-Estil shining upon their upturned faces. It was a promise spoken in unison, a single voice rising from hundreds, binding them not to a king or a land, but to an idea. They pledged their immortal lives to the stewardship of Middle-earth, to nurture its wild beauty and defend its free peoples from the lingering shadow of Morgoth. This was the final, conscious transformation of their great loss. Their exile was no longer a punishment to be endured, but a sacred mission to be fulfilled. They would use the hard-won wisdom from the fall of Valinor, the memory of Caladwen's sacrifice, and the lessons of the sea, to become gardeners of this new world, not its masters. In that moment, the last vestige of the old arrogance, the belief that they were destined only to live in perfect light, was washed away. They were the Eldar, the people of the stars, and their new destiny was to ensure that the stars over Middle-earth would never be extinguished by the same darkness they had barely escaped. Their purpose was now woven into the very soil beneath their feet, a living root connecting their past to a future they would have to build with their own hands. What kind of guardians would they become in a land that tested them at every turn? The seasons turned in their new home, weaving years into the tapestry of the forest. One evening, as the silver light of Gil-Estil mingled with the rising moon, a profound silence fell upon the settlement. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a sudden stillness that hushed the night birds and stilled the rustling leaves. Every elf, wherever they stood, felt a gentle but undeniable pull on their spirit, an invitation from a voice they had not heard since the shores of a lost world. In the heart of the great hall, a vision unfolded before Elrondin and the gathered council, a shimmering portal of pure, tranquil light. It was not the angry, grieving tempest of their exile, but a calm and peaceful gateway, and through it came a single, clear message from the Valar. The offer was one of profound grace, a one-time pardon. Any elf who truly wished it could step through this gateway and return to the undying peace of Valinor. There was only one condition. They must renounce completely and forever all ties to Middle-earth, to the lives they had built, the oaths they had sworn, and the land they now called home. The vision held for a long, breathless moment, the serene light of paradise, a stark contrast to the wild, starlit darkness of their hall. Then, without a single word being spoken aloud, the answer came. It was not a shout, but a quiet, collective turning away. An elder who had wept for years over lost gardens simply shook her head, her hand resting on the carved wooden rail of the hall she had helped build. A young hunter glanced toward the forest, where he had learned the language of the wolves and the deer, and he took a step back, not forward. Elrondin felt the memory of Caladwen's sacrifice like a warm ember in his heart, and he knew that to abandon this world would be to render her gift meaningless. One by one, and then all at once, they refused. The vision of the portal wavered and then faded, leaving only the familiar, earned light of their own star of hope. The silence that followed was different now, filled not with longing, but with a deep and settled certainty. Their exile was no longer a sentence passed upon them by distant powers. It had become a choice, reaffirmed in that silent moment by every single soul. They were the guardians of Middle-earth, and no memory of paradise, no matter how sweet, could ever outweigh the weight of that promise. The peace of the new settlement was a carefully tended garden, but a forgotten weed still grew in its shadows. They came at the darkest hour of the night, not with a roar, but with a silent, chilling purpose. Finvarin and the last of his Epanana, gaunt and hardened by their own desperate voyage, emerged from the tree line. Their eyes were fixed on the gentle glow of Gil Estel, the flower they saw not as a symbol of hope, but as the final, untainted ingredient for their interrupted ritual. Their attack was not a war cry, but a spreading stain. Tendrils of gray mist snaked from their hands, smothering the silver light and twisting the very air into a suffocating blanket. The defenders, still weary from building their new lives, found their movements slowed, their own inner light flickering under the assault. This was not a battle for land, but for the soul of their future. Elrondin stepped forward to meet Finvarin in the clearing before the hall, the corrupted mage radiating a hungry, inverted brilliance. There were no more words to be exchanged, only a final contest of wills. Bolts of twisted energy lashed out from Finvarin, each one carrying the echo of a dying paradise, a promise of power born from consumption. Elrondin deflected them, but each parry felt like holding back a tide of despair. He was a single candle against a hurricane of nothingness. He realized he could not win by fighting the darkness on its own terms. His strength was not in his own power, but in the community he served. Closing his eyes, he stopped resisting and instead opened himself completely. He reached out not with his hands, but with his spirit, touching the hearts of every elf in the valley. The farmer gripping her tool, the child clinging to a parent, the warrior standing firm. He drew upon their collective hope, their shared memories of the journey, their love for this new home, and the enduring echo of Caladwen's sacrifice. He channeled this vast, gentle power, focusing it through his own being. A light began to build around him, not the harsh, defiant glare he had used before, but a soft, inexorable radiance that held the color of dawn after a long night. It was a light of pure being, of life choosing to go on. He directed this collective hope not as a weapon, but as an answer. The beam of unified light met Finvarin's core of negation. There was no explosion, only a profound unraveling. The gray energy, the stolen power, the ancient hatred, it all dissolved like mist under a morning sun, unable to exist in the face of such accepted and shared love. Finvarin crumbled, not into dust, but into a faint, fading sigh, his grand ambition finally and utterly extinguished. As the last of the dark energy vanished, Elrondin felt a final, silent snap deep within his spirit. The last thin thread, the one mystical connection that had, despite everything, still tenuously linked them to the undying lands, had been severed. The path back to Valinor, already closed by decree, was now irrevocably broken by choice. The victory was absolute, but it was also a final, quiet funeral for the world they had been. The past, with all its beauty and its terrible flaws, was now truly, forever vanquished. The soft light of Gil Estel spilled across the rooftops of the new city, a gentle echo in the vast darkness of Middle-earth. Elrondin stood at the settlement's edge, the scent of pine and fresh, turned earth filling the air, and watched the eternal flower bloom. Its light was not the overwhelming brilliance of the two trees, but something more profound, a quiet, stubborn persistence, born from sacrifice. Here, in the cool night, the full weight of their journey settled upon him. He remembered Caladwen not as a ghost of a lost world, but as the foundation of this one, her final gift, the reason this light now shone upon a land that had never known such grace. They had not just lost a paradise, they had traded a gilded cage for a wild, living garden they were now sworn to protect. Their strength was no longer drawn from an external source of perfect light, but forged in the hardships of the sea, the grief of exile, and the hard-won trust they now placed in one another. The High Elves were gone, their perfection a memory. In their place stood the Eldar, guardians whose wisdom was etched by loss, and whose purpose was rooted in the rich, demanding soil of a world that needed them. This was not a fall from grace, but an awakening. Their story became a new kind of legend, not of a perfect heaven, but of a resilience that could find hope even in the ashes of paradise, building a future worth defending for all the ages to come.